Well, Pastor Barbara, as your liturgist, I'm concerned. There are no scripture readings this morning. Aren't we going to talk about the Bible?
Of course we are going to talk about the Bible. The challenge is I want to talk about what's missing.
What's missing? What do you mean by that? Either something's in the Bible or it's not.
Actually, it's not quite that simple. Let's just look at only the Gospels, since we've been talking about Mark and John and how they provide bookends and what's unique about them.
Sure, I know a little about this. We have 4 Gospels because each one has a different emphasis on the life of Jesus.
Very good, Gary. But can you name one story or quote from Jesus' life or teachings that is in all 4 Gospels?
Sure, just let me pick a story. Say, the story of the Good Samaritan that the youth acted out today.
Perfect choice. You think that's in all 4 Gospels? No, it's not. It's only found in Luke.
You're kidding, really?
I'm telling the truth.
How about the parable of the hidden treasure in the field or the expensive pearl?
Those are very, very good parables told together. And nope, only in Matthew.
Really? The
Yep.
house on the rock or the lost sheep?
Nope, not in Mark, not in John.
Okay, is there any parable that is found in all 4 Gospels?
No, there is not.
Well, let's just forget about the parables. And how about the events of Jesus' life? Like, feeding the 5,000.
Yes, that is in all 4 Gospels. Very good.
Okay, then, the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus teaches the Lord's Prayer, must be in all 4 also.
Sorry, it's not. There's no Sermon on the Mount or teaching of the Lord's Prayer in John's Gospel.
Wow, I feel like I don't know the Bible at all.
Well, listen, you're not alone, Gary. Let's just offer a little quiz this morning, see how everybody's doing out there in the congregation. We'll try to talk about what's missing from Mark and from John, and the way to do that is let's try to see if we can name things that are in all 4 Gospels.
Well, I tell you, I'm liking that because it gets me off the hook.
It does indeed. So let's see. Let's talk about, could we have the slide? Let's talk about, perfect. Love your enemies. Raise your hand. Just put your hand up if you think it's in all 4 Gospels. What you thinking, Gary? All 4 Gospels. Pretty important teaching of Jesus. Let's find out if it is in all 4 Gospels. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It is not. That's a tough one to have. So I guess we could say that it's interesting that it's not in all 4, but if you think about Mark, remember what we've been talking about, how the temple was destroyed, how their enemies had sent them off into the hillsides. If you think about John, where the Christians had been expelled from the synagogues and they were left on their own, well, maybe loving your enemies wasn't on the front burner for them. Let's try another one. Let's try another one here. How about that golden rule? Loving your neighbor in all the different ways that would be. How many think that's in all 4 Gospels? We have a hand back there. We have a few hands over here. And the answer is no. It is not in all 4 Gospels. You might have thought that would be in there also, but it's not in Mark and it's not in John, maybe for the same reasons that there was lots of difficulty with neighbors. But also we have to think about the fact that Mark believes Jesus is coming back soon, so he's not as concerned with how everybody's behaving around them as he is with sharing the good news succinctly and as quickly as possible. And by the time we get to John, he's much more concerned about showing signs and wonders that speak of Jesus' divinity than he is about talking about how people are behaving.
Okay, I've got one.
Okay.
Raise your hands if you think Jesus' entry into Jerusalem near the end of his life was in all 4 Gospels.
Let's see hands. That entry into Jerusalem. Hands. And the answer is? Yes! Now here's the thing, you should be watching the Matsiko Choir because they've been through this one already. It's just a thought. That was a good one. That was a good one. Now what I want to do is I want to stop for a second and I want to recap. I want to just give you a little list. We've talked about some. I want to tell you what's missing from Mark and John, Gary. Okay. There are no birth stories, no lineage of Jesus, no beatitudes, no command to love your enemies or your neighbors, no sending out the 70 ahead to see how that would go, no parables. There are some, but lots of them are missing, and no commissioning of the 12 to go preach.
Okay, so I know that Mark provides foundational material for Matthew and Luke. Is there anything that's only missing from Mark?
Let's do a little quiz, shall we? How many of you think it is women who see Jesus first in all the Gospels? Women who see Jesus first in all the Gospels. Let me see those hands.
Raise your hands.
Okay, could we have the answer? It's no. Now, the tricky part is there are women at the tomb in all the Gospels, but in Mark's Gospel, Jesus never appears to anyone because they hear the good news, the women hear it, and they get afraid and they run away, and that is where the Gospel ends in Mark.
So that means he also does not appear to the 11 disciples after the resurrection either.
That's right, he simply doesn't appear at all. The only other thing missing from Mark is Jesus speaking at some point, either before or after the resurrection, to his disciples about how they must forgive, whether it's 70 times 7 or forgiving in order to be forgiven, or forgiving or it isn't forgiven, all those things missing from Mark.
Okay, so I know wrote John much later and with a very different intention. More to show that Jesus with God or as being God himself in some way.
Right.
I know that he adds stuff about that.
Oh, he really does. And we're going to actually talk about that next week. What other materials do we find in Mark and John that aren't in the other Gospels?
But does John leave out much that is found in the other 3 Gospels?
Oh my gosh, John is so different that many things are left out. He's not concerned about the parables much at all. He's more concerned with Jesus saving humanity. Because he is God-like, or actually God in human form from the very beginning, as we talked about last week, there's no baptism story for sin, there's no temptation, because he was beyond all that. He was already God in a very human sense.
Okay, so let me ask the question to the congregation. Raise your hands if you think Jesus cleansed the temple in all 4 Gospels.
Did Jesus cleanse the temple in all 4 Gospels?
Hands.
What an ambivalent group. And the answer is, yes, he did. Those brave souls who put their hands up are correct. Even John's Jesus, maybe especially John's Jesus, has the authority to do something like that. How about this one, the story of the Transfiguration, where they go up the mountain and Jesus talks with Moses and Elijah, and he glows and he looks dazzling white. Is that in all 4 Gospels? Let's see. All 4 Gospels, what you thinking? Okay, let's check. It's not in all 4 Gospels. In the ones where it appears, it doesn't appear in John. And where this story appears, it seems like it's talking about who Jesus will be, or it's offering him some encouragement, or at best he is somehow conferring with the other prophets, so he's on par with them. John's Jesus is already way above and beyond all that. So let's just take a little recap on this now and cover some things that are important for you to know. In John's Jesus, as we said, no Sermon on the Mount or Sermon on the Plain. There's no big deal about choosing the 12 disciples, no big story about that. There's no commissioning them to preach in the end. There are very few healing stories, and he calls them signs or wonders because he just wants to tell those to show who Jesus is. He does not return to Nazareth and preach where he is rejected because he has no hometown story to be rejected from. There's no final Passover meal. There's no specific account of Judas conspiring to kill Jesus. There is not a thief on each side of Jesus at the crucifixion. Maybe all of this is to stay very focused on him. Sometimes it's hard to say, but I could go on. The list is huge.
I'm starting to see more how there are really big differences in the gospel accounts. And I see that the biggest differences are between Mark and John.
That's true. So what can you say about that, Gary?
Well, Mark's gospel, the earliest gospel, doesn't really have a happy ending with the good news being spread by Jesus' disciples.
No.
So he seems to be writing to get the good news out himself.
So true. And his is the shortest document with the briefest accounts of these stories. And Matthew and Luke, they draw from that and they elaborate on what Mark offers. And they also tell stories of their own, and they call upon a source named Q that we talk about in Bible study. And some of those teachings are simply their own. That's all really true. What can we say about John then?
Well, John's gospel is more about being sure people see the utter uniqueness and godliness of Jesus. showing him more as a savior in charge of things rather than a teacher and a healer.
Very, very good. In every way, when we read these Gospels, we're reading 4 very distinct accounts of Jesus. Each one is a kind of puzzle, and you can't take a piece out of one puzzle and fit it into one of the other puzzles. It simply won't fit. Each is its own. Thank you, Gary, so much for talking with me. You've described some of those basic differences between Mark and John. We've talked about what's missing from each of them, but when I ask that question, what is missing from these Gospels, these bookends, I am really asking also a bigger question of us about what is missing. We see the message of Jesus Christ told like 30 years after his death, and then maybe 70 or more years after his death. We see how the message of Jesus Christ shifts a little bit and is designed and told for its particular time and place and circumstance. So part of what I'm asking this morning when I say what's missing is our story of the gospel. How do we understand the message of Jesus Christ and how it relates to our very particular time and circumstance? This is something we're going to talk about more next week as we finish up this series on Mark and John, the gospel bookends we've been talking about. But now we're going to do a little bookend of a different sort. We started our morning with the Matsiko Choir. The bookend is we will finish our morning with the Matsiko Choir. Would you come and sing for us again, please?